This talk today is balancing inspiration with technique. And I think everybody has a feeling for themselves of what inspiration is, and it's really nothing more than the oil in the machinery. It's really, inspiration is something that comes from what you love to do. And we all have it, and we all share in this. And this talk is more about what a painter sees in it and balancing inspiration with technique. I know that it's really a self-discovery. It's really a relationship that you have with your ability to be professional, your ability to use your technique and be inspired in doing it. So it's a complex issue, but it's something that, believe it or not, can be transferred, it can be taught, and it's something that is really the primary force in art, is inspiration. I started painting when I was 8 years old. My dad introduced me to Frank Mason, who was a colleague of his at the Art Students League in New York, and I studied with him for 14 years. And this artist was just a brilliant example of inspiration. He just looked for it in everything, and he had this keen way of bringing it out in you. He would, anyway, he would make us bend over and look at the mountains and see the pink in the sky, but he had this gift. And his gift was, in explaining, he taught art by actually grabbing your paints and grabbing your palette as you were working in the field, and he would give you a crit right on the field. And generally he gave them to the pretty girls. He liked the pretty girls, but if you were lucky enough to get a crit, you would save these for life. And I know that I would save them. I wouldn't paint over them. A lot of people would paint over them, and I would just make a copy of it and try and get that same inspiration that he was conveying, because literally what he did was, so what Frank Mason's gift was, is he would come up to your painting, and he'd say, he had this big barrel chest, he was about 6'4", and he had this presence about him, and he'd come up, let me see what you're doing here. And he'd grab your paints, and he'd take the biggest brush he could find, he'd take your whole palette of white, and he'd slap this thing right across your painting, and you go, yeah! You just ruined my painting. And if you were that sensitive, you'd just break out in tears and go, what was this? Anyway, he said, see the light effect? And there it was. He was teaching you how to see, and he'd show the light. And he had this ability of doing this motion, which is a forehand and a backhand. It's a lazy figure eight. It was like in an infinity circle, and everything he did, he let the light come in and go out. He put the shadow under it and let the shadow go out. He put the color on top and let it fade off. Everything was in this stroke. He was like Federer playing tennis. It was unbelievable. And that was Frank Mason. I remember he had this one crit. We were out in the end of the world. We were sitting on these rocks in Quoddy Head, Maine, which is the furthest point down east, up in Lubec, Maine. And we were painting the sea there. And so we're sitting out on this rock at the end of the world, and this one of Frank's students, her husband has come up to see what we were doing, what was going on. Is that going to fall over? Hopefully that's it. And see what we were doing. So he says he thinks I'm going to give this woman a crit. So he starts out, and she's painting this rock, and she says, and he goes and he takes the whole painting and he puts this. You're only 5 minutes away from a masterpiece, he'd always say. And this is what Dumont would tell him, because I was his teacher who was at the Art Students League, and he was one of the starters of the Art Students League, and he taught there for 100 years. Anyway, he'd get on this painting and he'd turn this painting into this crashing sea with this violet swim, and he'd do these strokes like this, and within seconds he had this whole thing going. And the woman was just about to grab the painting so she could take it and show it to her husband to keep it. And Frank would go, and now if you look at this, maybe you could turn this thing into, you see that light over there? And he'd do this thing, and he'd do the swim all over again. He'd turn it into this big storm with a lighthouse in it, this big red light. And then he'd go, the lady was just about to take the painting again. And she had this masterpiece she was going to get as a cred. She said, you see that light over there? And he'd take this thing and he'd turn the thing into a field with a red barn in it. It was the most outstanding thing I'd ever seen. But it was all about talking about this swim. And everything was just loose in this motion. Well, anyway, it was after that I had a pretty difficult time one year, almost as bad a year as I had this year. But I had dropped out of college. My parents were furious with me. I had sort of separated with them. I was going to go to art school. I'd got a 4F deferment. I was ready to get drafted into the Army. All this stuff was going on. I finally said, I'm finally free. I'm going to try modern art.
Oh, wow.
So I got my pickup truck, and I went down to United House Records. I don't know if you ever heard of them, here in Stamford. And I filled it up full of all these old screens. And I brought them back to my studio, and I don't know what I was smoking or what I was doing, but I'd be ripping off my clothes and dancing in the studio, just yelling and screaming and throwing this drip paints and this house paint all over these screens. And I had this whole collection of absolute garbage. Finally, my neighbor comes in, he starts to look at this stuff, and he goes, wow, my 6-year-old kid could do better than this. And I'm like thinking about it, and I'm going, you know what I'm lacking here is a little bit of discipline.
Maybe.
So with that, I ended up going back to the league and studied for another 6 or 7 years with Frank Mason. And at this time, I'm looking at artists and wondering what kind of art do I want to paint in, and I'm looking at, in front of my house, we live in Salem Straits in Darien. I know Diana's right there in Scotts Cove. Well, we had a most famous painter there, John Frederick Kensett, who had his studio on Contentment Island. And I'm looking at these Contentment Island paintings and his work, and I'm noticing that the same stippling light effect that he produced on the rocks was the same exact effect that Vermeer was producing in his tapestries and his jewelry and the little. I can see that. And I'm like going, these guys are seeing the same light. They're painting in the same style. So I started to investigate techniques. And I worked with an Italian restorer in the city, Piero Manoni, for 10 years. And we translated thousands of recipes from old master manuscripts. And we went through the whole gamut. And he finally told me, you know, I don't know what you're doing here. You should go to Italy and see the great masterpieces. So I got on a plane, I went to Italy, and I remember sitting at Da Vinci Airport on the stoop going, just bawling my eyes out, saying, what the hell am I doing here? I don't understand anybody, and I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, he introduced me to a friend, another restorer named Luciano Moranzi. And he was, the first thing we did is we went up to see the Michelangelo restoration. We were on the scaffolding, and I was touching the ceiling. Unfortunately, it was the biggest destruction we've ever seen in terms of a restoration, and that's a whole other story that I'll get into another time. But from there, I learned how to street paint, and I ended up going to all the museums and copying the paintings and copying mostly the statuary from the Farnese collection, the Borghese Palace, even up in Florence with the Pitti Palace and the Uffizi and all of these, the David. So I made a collection of these statuary. Mostly, I particularly like the Greeks, and I started to notice something very curious. There was a power in these sculptures that was beyond anything that I'd ever understood. It wasn't a visual 2D or 3D representation. It was something that is obviously defined as classicism, and so many of us have tried to define it. The basic simple definition is a curve juxtaposed to a straight line. So a good example is on that horse screen right there where you see the mare on that horse screen. You'll see that I have like a 2-foot ruler, and it's the whole length of her nose is exactly a ruled straight line. And under it, you'll see the curve of the jaw. And that is the basic fundamentals of classicism, how to marry that curve with that straight line. It's like trying to put a circle in a square or a sphere in a cube, which is the language of 3D art. And classicism defines it. It's really the cyma recta, which is that G clef in music. It's the staff with a lazy S that forms a little circle, that forms a bigger circle, which is like a nautilus, an increased proportion of how growth in our nature is. And it's like a subliminal message to us all when you see these patterns in Greek art and in classical art. So I have one example here, which is this bone. Circle. This is really an idealized form of that G clef. And it's the nature of our bones. It's the nature of our growth. You can see the pattern rotating around and then rotating back. And that was really the symbol of the Renaissance. Like here you see this pattern. This is the nautilus. You can just see how it grows in this circle. And it's really a 3, 4, 5 triangle.
Yeah, hold it up.
You can see, I don't know if you can see, you can pass it around, but you see the whole pattern. It's really a nautilus. And when you divide a 3, 4, 5 triangle, it's a growth pattern. And that's the golden mean. That's what we all subliminally know in our texture, in our framework, but we don't see it constantly. Well, with that, I was able to come home, and I opened up a studio in Darien, but I had been missing one point of this whole puzzle. When I looked at Renaissance art and the great masters, the Flemish masters, I could see that they were able to paint as quickly as their inspiration because they had paints that fixed immediately. They dried. There wasn't any drying time, waiting. There wasn't any of this layering 2 weeks later or putting it in the sun or baking it or going to acrylics or doing something else. These guys were such masters of paint that they could dry their oils instantly or at the rate that they wanted. And then after that, after they dried, they could layer on glazes of color, like films of color, and get these prismatic effects. Like you could put a dead base color of blue and layer on top a brilliant yellow, and you'd get this fabulous green. And it's a color you can't reproduce in tubes. There's no way you can get it from a tube. Because it's all over the place, and all of a sudden you layer this film on, every aspect has a different tone, and that's what, there are no tubes for color, for Renaissance paints. It's all a misconception. Anyway, I had the good fortune of one day stumbling into a guy that I'd known at the Art Students League, and he was a harpsichord maker, and he wanted me to teach him how to draw so that he could paint figures and landscapes on his instruments. And he had this folio of old violin recipes that he had gotten from this ancient Italian fiddle maker. And I saw this folio of recipes, and I knew exactly what they were. They were drying varnish mediums. And all I had to do was incorporate them into what I had known already about the old master manuscripts and transluce it into paint. And I was able then to put 5 layers of paint on top of each other and glaze these colors and do everything that the old masters, not everything, but working on it, could do. So I had this freedom, and it was immediately, I mean, the people who bought my paintings were saying, "What happened to you? Your paintings look alive. They've got color in them. It's a whole new look." Anyway, from there I started to look more deeply at the Luminous School, which is the school that I made my last talk about. And I realized that this is still the extension of the Renaissance, and it's still the path that I wanted to keep with. And regardless of what technology is doing and how fast it's moving, I still prefer to mix my own paints, make my own grounds, my own mediums, and just continue on this path. So I'm very happy doing this. Right now, I'm writing a book on stopping time with paint, is the title of it, because my whole emphasis is to draw you into the painting with these lazy S's and out of the paintings and hold you in the painting as long as you can so that you're transfixed in the scene. And that's when you've stopped time and you get this sensation. And it's really an introduction into old master techniques. So my next talk is going to be on subjective and objective abstraction, where all art is abstract. And anyway, I hope you like these paintings.
Oh my word, Peter, that was absolutely great.
Yeah.
Brilliant, Peter. I mean, really. I hope that was recorded.
Oh yeah, we got it.
I mean, really, Peter.
I got it on too.
Well,
I like the eye contact, by the way.